Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar and conversation today. I'm Yolanda Pierce, professor and dean at Vanderbilt Divinity School and the author of Hell Without Fires, The Wounds Are the Witness, and In My Grandmother's House. So we are quickly approaching the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And we find ourselves at a pivotal moment of reflection. Now is the time we can remember our history and also ask questions of it. What stories have we inherited? Whose voices have shaped those stories? And whose voices have been left out of those stories? Today, we aim to take an honest look at where we are as a country. We want to understand the forces that threaten our democracy. We want to remember the movements and the people that have carried this nation forward in times of unrest. And we want to discover, how do we sustain ourselves for the work ahead? So I'm joined today by three incredible authors whose work helps us to illuminate this moment. And so I invite you to meet them. First, we have Angela P. Dotson, former senior editor of the New York Times and former executive editor of Black Issues Book Review. She is the editor of We Refuse to Be Silent, Women's Voices on Justice for Black Men, author of Remembering the Ladies, Celebrating Those Who Fought for Freedom at the Ballot Box, and the founder of Editors on Call, LLC. She has written and edited for outlets like Essence, Heart and Soul, The Washington Star, and the Louisville Courier-Journal. Her new book, We Have Been Here Before, How Rebellion and Activism Have Always Sustained America, was published just last week. Welcome, Angela. So glad you're here. Now, our second author is Darren Johnson. Darren has served in the Pentagon, State Department, and White House. He is a graduate of Yale College and Harvard Law School. A professor of law at Howard University, he is a scholar and commentator on international law, national security, foreign affairs, and human rights. He is the author of Digital Coup, The Conspiracy to Thwart Global Democracy. Welcome, Darren.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Yolanda.
And last but certainly not least, we are welcomed by Tiffany G. Townsend. Tiffany is president of Core Perspectives, LLC, and former chief diversity officer at Purdue University Global and Augusta University. With decades of experience as a psychologist and educator, she guides organizations through transformative change, building cultures where diverse perspectives thrive. Her work appears in numerous scientific journals and media outlets. She is the author of Weathering the Storm, Navigating the Anti-Social Justice Wave. Welcome, Tiffany.
Thank you, Yolanda. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's an honor to be among these authors and to be a part of this conversation. I'm looking forward to it.
I'm so excited. So let me transition us into the conversation for the day, and thank you all for being here. I want to begin with our current moment, a very complicated current moment. So right now we are facing renewed and sustained efforts to reshape the narrative of America's founding and our national identity, including, of course, claims that America was intended to be a Christian nation and efforts to minimize or erase histories of injustice and resistance. So I want to start there. I want to ask each of you, what is your reaction to the ways in which America's story is being retold and reshaped in this current moment? Because I want us to talk about what is the most urgent thing people need to know right now about what's going on in our national conversation. So this is a question that's open to any of you all.
I'm happy to jump in.
please.
I would say that the issue that we really need to be honest with is that for all of the great accomplishments that we've had in the United States as a multiracial democracy, we've really only been a true democracy for about 60 years with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. There will be a lot of celebrations about our 250-year history, but I think we also need to couch those celebrations with that truth, right? That we often are described as the world's oldest democracy, but in truth, if you think about it from the perspective of when our democracy was actually a democracy for all, it's only been 60 years. And so when we look at it from that perspective, it's a really a new project in terms of multiracial inclusive democracy. And it's a project that we see, unfortunately, many forces currently undermining.
Right. We have to look at how the current administration is trying to strip the history from various projects, including tearing up the Black Lives Matter pavilion, taking down signage at the president's house in Philadelphia that referenced slavery, diminishing Harriet Tubman's role in the Underground Railroad in another exhibit. All of them are attempts to basically erase us and to not have these stories told to our children and to future generations.
And to kind of follow up on what Angela and Darren mentioned, I think this idea of erasing history is really about narrative control, right? It's to restructure the narrative and to flip the idea of what this work is intended to do. If you don't know your history, then you don't understand where we're trying to go and why we are doing what we're doing. And so this idea of justice work being reframed as being divisive, being reframed as being indoctrination, when in actuality, if we knew the history and we knew and understood what we were trying to fight against, then we would understand why it's necessary to have these legislations, these laws, these programs. But if you don't know that history, then it's very easy for you to accept that narrative and think that what we're doing is actually discrimination as opposed to righting a wrong. So I think this idea of erasing history is about a larger idea of rewriting our narrative. And that's what is really concerning for me, is that we have to be very clear about what justice work is and why we're in this fight. And I think understanding and appreciating our history is the first step to that, but also appreciating that we've been in this place before. When I saw the name of Angela's book, I said, oh my goodness, I feel like that could have been the name of my book. That could have been, I mean, you know,
Right.
We've been here before. And so if we can appreciate the fact that this backlash that we're seeing is not new. The tactics that they're using, they're not new, and that folks have been able to overcome them before. Look at where we are. So we know we can get past this. We have to appreciate our history first to understand how our ancestors, our forefathers were able to do that. And so, so while I'm concerned, I'm also very hopeful because I know that this is not new and we've conquered this before.
That is a great way to segue into me asking each of you particular questions about your books. So Darren, in Digital Coup, one of the things I find fascinating is that you argue that misinformation isn't simply false information, that it's become an ecosystem. So talk to us a little bit about what misinformation is and what's changed about the way that truth itself actually functions in our public life.
Yeah, absolutely. So, my book explores the fact that we are now in an era, which I argue we've been in for over 10 years now, where democracies around the world have been undermined intentionally by efforts through social media and digital platforms to create disinformation, right? So disinformation from the standpoint of creating false identities about who is presenting information. I think we're all quite familiar with the 2016 presidential election and everything that was discovered following that, and that was released in the Robert Mueller report. And that's really the starting point for my book, which is discussing that revelation that occurred where the public globally really became aware of this new front of warfare where foreign state Russia had decided that they would use social media to basically undermine democracy by studying American society, creating fissures through disinformation that would both polarize us, make us upset at each other, but also suppress certain communities from voting. And so those tactics that were really originated by Russia in 2016 have now become commonplace. And so, as your question noted, we do have an ecosystem of what I call the digital coup ecosystem, where we now have not only governments, authoritarian governments, but we have private parties, private actors selling their services to create disinformation campaigns for candidates, for political parties all around the world, all with the goal of undermining democracies globally.
Tell us about the costs, right? So people are hearing this and say, okay, well, yeah, that's happening, but what are the consequences of something like this? What if taken to this next election or the one after that, and other things beyond elections? What does it cost us as a democracy when misinformation and disinformation seem to be so rampant? What should scare us and keep us up at night?
Well, I think what should keep us up at night is the fact that, we often think about democracy in terms of the election cycle and, who's up and who's down. But the reality is that these disinformation, these digital coup attacks are much broader. They're not simply targeted at the election cycle. They're targeted at the body public in democracies writ large. And so even outside of the election cycle, you have these efforts to disinform, you have these efforts to convince Americans or other targets of these campaigns that members of their own society, right, are taking extreme views on these issues regularly. And so what I think that has done is it's caused us here in America to see each other in a particular way, right? To see each other from the extremes and to think that the voices of extremity are larger than they actually are, right? To create these false impressions of the views that some might hold, but to give the impression that those views are much broader and much louder. And so that those attacks create polarization, they can lead to radicalization, they can lead to civil strife. And so that's part of this project, is not only to affect the election cycle, but also to undermine particularly multiracial diverse democracies from within by causing members of the public to see each other in polarized ways. And so I think that's one of the things that should keep us up at night, along with the potential for generative AI to exponentially increase the harms of these digital coup campaigns.
So I love what you're saying. Not that it is happening, but what you're suggesting is that we don't trust each other. So we don't trust our political leaders, and we don't trust each other. So how does a person who actually wants to be politically aware, how does that person begin to discern real, true information from the disinformation? How does that person in this space of generative AI, where a meme can go viral, in seconds? How do you begin to sort of try to ferret out what is the truth among all of the lies?
Yeah, well, one thing that I encourage everyone to do is to have a healthy dose of skepticism, right, about what the information that we're taking in online, and to engage in verification, right? So one of the things that everyone can do is we can all research and go directly to the to information that social media platforms provide themselves about the extent to which they are engaging in content moderation to prevent disinformation. One of the unfortunate things that we've seen over the last couple of years is that many social media companies and digital platforms have moved away from content moderation. They've reduced or fired their teams that regularly focused on preventing or limiting the amount of false information occurring online. So one thing to do is to check and to see whether your preferred social media platform engages in and has a robust content moderation practice and policy. And if it doesn't, then to view the information that you're receiving from that source, even that site, even more skeptically, because you know that there is not oversight preventing this disinformation.
Right. And the other thing is that we kind of live in information silos where everybody watches a different network TV or is on a different social platform. You have to kind of expose yourself to a variety of sources for news. I tend to watch what's MS Now, was MSNBC, but once a day I switch to ABC's evening news, so I get a different perspective. And because they do a wider variety of news rather than MS Now sort of focuses on politics and Washington news, and ABC will give you the whole world in about 30 minutes, and it's worth coming off of that one platform to see what else is going on in the world. And not enough people do that. Not enough people read, for that matter. I can't remember the statistics now, but there's an astonishing number of people who never read a book after college. So those are problems in our society, but those are ways that you can protect yourself from all of the falsehoods. And sometimes you just have to turn off the TV.
Right.
When our current president is being broadcast live, I tend to turn away and wait for the news to distill it for me.
So I love that most of that all of us actually orbit are actually connected to higher education in many different ways. And so critical thinking, critical writing, research skills are just, regardless of the field, the major, the discipline, are at the heart of it, right? Which is, how do you dig to get to some facts and some truths? And Angela, when you said, most people don't read a book after college, some of them are not reading books in college anymore. And that, is part of the issue. So that leads me to you, Angela, and your book and your work, because one of the things that you do in your work is you remind us that we've been here before, right? Which is to say that this story of America has always been shaped by contradictions, contestations, activisms, rebellions. That this is not new, because we've been here before. So I want, as you kind of look across the history and as you were writing, what is it that you're seeing that shows us or helps us to understand, how does democracy survive amid these periods of division and then backlash, and then we go back and then we go forward a little bit and then we take 2 steps back? How do we survive these periods of division?
Well, I think part of it is in the design of our democracy. Whatever you might think of the founding fathers, they established a system that can work. It doesn't always work, but the structure is good. Our voting system is good. The fact that we have leaders that come to the fore and stay in place even when there's chaos around them. We survived a civil war with a government still in place, and we'll survive a lot of other things. But there has to be a core of people who are true to the structure of democracy, particularly American democracy as we know it. And who will continue to believe in it, who will continue to run for office, who will continue to hold those offices, and who will continue to abide by the laws.
So be explicit with our viewers. what parts of American history are we in real time watching being erased and effaced? What are the stories? What are the narratives? What are the communities that we are at this very present moment watching being erased from the larger national narrative?
Mostly Black history, but also women's history, the people who shaped it, the facts about slavery itself, um, facts about the civil rights movement, um, and even recent figures. We don't that the CIA and FBI tried to distort the history of Dr. King and Malcolm X and people like that. Um, we have to be very careful that we know our history. I was recently invited to give an address at my alma mater, Marshall University in West Virginia, um, which is in Huntington, which was also the home of Dr. Carter G. Woodson, um, the historian. And I was invited to give the Carter G. Woodson address. And my title was, What Would Carter G. Woodson Do Now in this moment of history? And I concluded that, for one, he would teach. That was his first calling, and that's what he did. He would organize. He would hold forums where people could discuss these things. And those are some of the things we need to do now, and make sure that we are teaching our young people and teaching each other, no matter how old you are, to provide places where we can organize and listen to each other and discuss these things as we are right now. So
One of the things that deeply concerns me is the erasure, not just of history, meaning something that happened literally 200 or 250 years ago, but the assault on really the edges of living memory. So you mentioned Dr. King, you mentioned the civil rights movement, where there is an attempt to try to erase and efface history that still has living participants, right? There are people who were there, who participated, and we're trying to, in some respects, pretend like their stories didn't happen or forgive them. We Ruby Bridges is still here with us, telling her story, right? And somehow the history of segregation and desegregation, we want to erase it when the very people whose lives were so deeply impacted by it are still living. What does that tell you? How do you reconcile not only wanting to erase, history by way of 1 or 2 centuries, but by trying to erase the things that are happening even in people's living memory? Is it gaslighting? Maybe that's really my question.
no, it's definitely gaslighting, but it's more sinister than that, I think. Um, that to try to make you believe something that you saw with your own eyes. We see this on the news every day. They keep telling us things didn't happen that we saw happen, like January 6th. So I think that we have to be very, very protective of our own knowledge, our own history, and make sure that we're telling our children, at least, what was real and what isn't real, and to keep reminding ourselves what, no, I read that for myself. I saw that for myself on TV, whatever it takes to stay sane. One part of my book deals with the labor history, and I started with a march that coal miners had in 1921. 10 to 20,000 coal miners gathered near a creek and then headed over a mountain to protest some of the means that were being used against them to stop them from organizing as a labor union. And part of my fascination with it is that the miners met and had their staging area within about 2 miles of where I lived in high school. And I had never heard of this whole episode of history. It's called the Battle of Blair Mountain. And I thought perhaps it was because my family had not really moved to West Virginia yet or been established that year. My parents weren't born till a year later. And my mother's family didn't come to West Virginia for another 5 years. But I started calling my friends, lawyers and journalists and educators in West Virginia, or who had grown up and spent more time in West Virginia than I had, because I spent my childhood elsewhere, to ask them if they had ever heard of this incident and what they knew about it. And to a one, they all said they never heard of it until they were much, much older. Most of us till we were nearly in our 30s, and that was because a movie came out that partly was documenting the events that led up to this action by the miners. And the incident was broken up because the federal government sent in armed troops and bombs to get these people off this mountain. But yet their parents, their grandparents, their educators never passed the story on, even though in West Virginia you are required to take West Virginia history. Yet none of us knew about it. So that is erasure, and it was a deliberate erasure.
Oh, absolutely. I see the connections between the erasure and then the disinformation and the misinformation, right? The you can't believe your lying eyes, right, of the current historical moment, as well as really placing a certain amount of distrust for our community's oral narratives, which is how we've passed down so much of our history. And all of these are connected. So I want to turn to you, Tiffany, because your book, Weathering the Storm, speaks to so much of this, but you're speaking also directly to people who feel exhausted by backlash, and discouraged by this regression that we're seeing, a regression of equity and social justice work, a regression of certain gains, a regression, we could say politically, of voting rights. I mean, this backlash. And so I would love if you would talk to us a little bit about some of this backlash, what you're seeing in the people who are still trying to stay in the fight, and also what you're seeing with people who feel like they want to opt out because they're so discouraged by
Yeah.
the exhaustion of the backlash.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's so important. And I think, thank you for that question, Yolanda, because I think sometimes when we're trying to encourage folks to stay in the fight, we might want to minimize, the rollback, or act like we're not seeing what we're actually seeing. That rollback is real. It's devastating for people who have spent their careers trying to advocate for change, to actually see all of the efforts that they've put in for decades just kind of disappear in the amount of a pen strike, or so I think one of the things, and we are seeing it, the disillusionment. I mean, I personally experienced it. I got caught up in some of that rollback and backlash. I was a DEI officer, and so I personally was attacked by this backlash. But I think one of the things that I wanted to raise in the book was this notion of radical hope. And radical hope does not mean that we don't see what's coming or understand what's coming. It's this idea that we can hold two things at once, that we can know what we're up against, at the same time appreciate that we've been here before and have gotten through before, so that we have a strategy for addressing this backlash. And so, yes, there are people who are getting tired. But what I want to speak to is, how do we keep moving forward even in the midst of all that we have seen? And part of that is appreciating that we're a part of something bigger, that there are others who are in this fight, and that together not only are we more powerful, But there is healing in being a part of a group that is really fighting for change. And when you come together, that collective advocacy, that's the bomb, right? That is what helps you to feel like you can keep going. So we have to know, and what Angela does in her book is illuminate that history. That's so important. We have to appreciate what we're up against. But in illuminating that history, we also see a path to how we can continue to move forward. We see what has been done before, and their tactics that they have been using throughout history. That's what I call the redemptionist playbook. And their tactics, the gaslighting, the stereotyping, the microaggressions, the violence and intimidation, all of those are intentional, all of those are strategic, and we see them cropping up every time there's been some push for change and movement towards justice. That's when we see this backlash. So one of the things that I wanted to highlight in the book is this backlash should make you feel like, oh my gosh, let me put my head down. This backlash should say, we're doing something right because we got you shook. We got you scared. That's why you're pushing so hard because you know that we were able to affect change. So we have to kind of appreciate, yes, when you get that backlash, there is a strategy to address it. We have our forward bearers who were able to do so. And the fact that they are pushing back so hard, that's confirmation that we're doing the right thing. So that's what I want people to appreciate. Not, oh, it's just going to be all right. Just no, this is a fight for sure. But we have the tools, we have the strategies, and we together can actually make sure that we continue to move towards change.
How do you hold that tension, right? So there's this radical hope that's at the core of what your work is. And that radical core of hope is deeply connected to our history, and the examples that we have. And then there's also, I want to argue, people who are grieving, people who are just really struggling with how bad things have gotten again so quickly, how quickly the backlash happened, how fast the dismantling of some gains happened, right? And again, you and I, in knowing higher education as well as we do, the stroke of a pen dismantled programs that had existed for 25, 30 years, right?
Yeah.
In the course of a semester. And so how do we help people to hold together that tension when there's real grief? There's grief over communities as they are watching racial gerrymandering just change their districts where they can even vote, as we are watching at universities cultural programs that have benefited thousands of students disappear, scholarships that were given to children gone. How do we really reconcile with the grief and the disappointment we feel at a nation when that backlash has happened at such rapid speed?
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. And I think that is kind of this notion, right, of holding the two things. We can't pretend that that has not happened in the impact of that and what that means on our inner self and our spirit, right? Grieving is real. And so I think the difference is while we acknowledge the grief is kind of acknowledging that something real has happened, and we have to do that. But I say it's different than hopelessness, right? Hopelessness says this is happening and there's nothing we can do about it. And it's the outcome has already been decided. We don't know what the outcome is going to be. So to me, that's the difference. It's acknowledging, yes, things have turned and this grief is real. You're going through something that is real. We cannot turn away from that. But we also can't predetermine what the outcome is going to be. And that's the hope piece. That's the radical hope. This faith that, yes, it's bad right now, but we have a strategy to make sure we can continue to move forward. The other piece to that is that we have to pour into ourselves in this moment. We're in a storm. So that means we have to prepare ourselves. We have to prepare our psyche for this storm. So a part of this collective action is collective healing, taking care of each other, making sure that we're pouring into ourselves so that we are ready for this fight. That's real. And so I think it's important for us to make sure that a part of the preparation is the self-care, is the community care. How do we stay joyful in this moment? That's a part of the care, that we're doing things to pour into ourselves, meaning that we're taking care of ourselves. Because when you have a system that is constantly trying to pull you down, the fact that you can be joyous in that moment, knowing what you are up against, not pretending that it's not there, but knowing and saying, you will not, pull me down. You will not break my spirit. That's resistance, right? So for me, that's the peace. That's the hope, to know that yes, we've been here. Yes, we're here now. Yes, we're in a storm, but there is a path, and together we can make that path, and we can heal each other while we're doing
I love it. That's a good Beyonce, "You Won't Break My Soul"
it.
moment, for all of us. So for the three of you, I have this question, because I really think, part of doing this work is to kind of lay bare in a very honest and real way who's on each of the sides of these tensions. So my question is that whether we're talking about social media algorithms, whether we're talking about disinformation, whether we're talking about the erasure of histories at our national parks, or the dismantling of programs, who is benefiting? Right. So none of this would be happening if some people, some group, someone wasn't benefiting on the other side. So who benefits when we strip away the history at the national park? Who benefits when we dismantle a 25-year-old scholarship? Who benefits when the disinformation that is abroad can change our life? Who's benefiting from all of this, all of these threats against our democracy?
Well, it's the autocrats and oligarchs and the people on the right who benefit the most, or at least they think it's going to be beneficial to them, or it wouldn't be happening. It's certainly not the poor people. It's certainly not people at the bottom who can benefit. But if you keep people, weak enough and uneducated enough, and Carter G. Woodson said something to that effect, they will begin to believe it, and they will hold themselves down. So that's what the tactic is. That's who it's benefiting.
Yeah, and I would agree and say it's, the beneficiaries are, I'll go so far as to say enemies within and enemies without, right? So you've got foreign autocrats, foreign authoritarians who want to see the American democratic project fail, because that allows them to pursue their objectives to a greater degree. But you also have folks who are domestic, right, constituents who you would hope would want to see America remain strong, but have made a calculation, right, that by weakening our efforts at inclusivity and access and truth furthers their interests, right? Whether that's an oligarchic capital interest, or whether that is a perception about power rooted in kind of this narrative of this racial narrative, right? And so I want to talk for a second, right, about things like Project 2025, right? Angela mentioned earlier, right, that what we're seeing is sinister, right? And I agree with that. What we're seeing is the culmination, quite frankly, of many decades of effort at rolling back many of the advances that have been made in the past 60 years since the second Reconstruction, because there are those who have an ideology where they believe that increased access, increased power for people of color limits their own interests, and they have been able quite effectively, including through the use of narrative and through the use of disinformation, to polarize a base that agrees with that viewpoint, even if all of this rollback and all of these efforts are also negatively impacting that base itself.
Yeah.
And so I think this kind of sinister project, we have to name it. And as Tiffany was talking about, we're at a moment where it requires radical hope. I agree. And we're also at a moment where it requires radical honesty. You know, I kind of I'm a Gen Xer, right? Post civil rights era. And I can remember past few decades where, you know, we'd have these debates about social issues and we wouldn't want to go so far as to offend someone or to say that they had an agenda that was, you know, necessarily against a particular group. I think we're at a moment where we that kind of those polite niceties that were commonplace in a normal political cycle, we don't have time for that, right? We have to tell the truth and to tell it completely. And part of that truth is there are a group of individuals, both outside and inside the United States, that have made it part of their agenda to limit economic opportunity, political power, and access for African American community and other communities because their ideology is such that any increased power for our community limits their, or because they don't necessarily believe that, but they know that they can cause others to believe that. And so I think we got to call it out, and I think we've got to push back as hard as possible with the truth.
And to follow up to Darren's point about the truth, right? One of the, I think, narratives that go around or that is pervasive in this country because of the structure of this country is that there's a zero-sum game, right? So if I progress, you know, as a Black woman, that means that you necessarily, white man, must not do well. That you can't have win-win. It has to be one person is winning and somebody has to lose. And by really perpetuating this notion, it really pits us against each other. And there's a small group of people that benefit when we're fighting, right? So if all of us are fighting for a very small amount of resources, then we lose sight of all of the resources that we don't have access to. And so this narrative that we're in competition, that the races are in competition, certain SES groups are in competition, all of these different groups are in competition with each other, really helps to prevent us from seeing who actually is gaining in this system. It's not mostly white Americans. It's a small amount of folks that are winning. So when you talk about who's gaining, you have to appreciate and understand that this zero-sum game narrative that we have here does not serve most people, not even white Americans, right? This idea that racism serves most white Americans, it doesn't actually. It only serves a very small group of people who are at the top, very top 1%. Everybody else is losing. That's the narrative. That's the truth that we need to kind of say. That if we are so focused on fighting each other, we really can't see what the real issues are. And by coming together, this is the truth that we don't want, that is not wanted to be told. That if we were to come together, different SESs, different nationalities and backgrounds, we would appreciate that there's a large sum of resources that nobody has access to except the 1%. And we could then come together to restructure the system in a win-win that would allow access to many more groups. But right now we're fighting because that's the narrative, right? And so I think that's the truth that we need to correct.
I love that because you took me to where I was going to ask the three of you all to be mythbusters. Okay. And to be a mythbuster is to say, what is a myth that through your own work you need to bust, that we need to let go of as a country so that there is a truth that can emerge, right? So let me give you an example from my own field. I'm a scholar of religion. And during this time, I particularly hear a lot of rhetoric about America as a Christian nation from its founding. Um, when I say, well, here's a myth that I can bust for you very easily. Something like 20 to 30% of enslaved Africans who were brought to this country were practicing Muslims. The presence of Islam has been in this country longer than this country has been a country, right? So what I'm trying to do is to bust a myth that the only religion that this world, this quote unquote then new world, but now the United States of America has ever seen is Christianity. Because if we affirm that, then we don't see the nature of how Islam was practiced, how early Judaism in America was practiced, the indigenous practice, the indigenous spiritual practices that were here before our nation had a name, a declaration of independence, a constitution, or anything. So I'd love for you all to bust that a myth. That's something that's important and crucial in your own work. And Tiffany, that's where you had gone, right? Which is like you're trying to say here, there's a myth that if this particular group wins something, someone has to lose something, right? Like that really is so pervasive in our political understanding. If someone has access to something, that means someone else does not get access to it. So here, be mythbusters for me about America's story so that we can actually tell some truths.
Well, one of them for me in our research was how the Europeans related to the Native Americans and vice versa. We have an image that things always went smoothly and that the Native Americans welcomed them with open arms and they all sat down and had Thanksgiving together. And that's basically what we teach our children. But in many cases, the Native Americans attacked the incoming colonist with good reason, or they scared them off. And sometimes the colonists attacked the Native Americans. So there's a lot more tension there than we normally teach our children. The other area for me is the level of resistance against slavery. We tend to think of, or at least teach our children, that the slaves were kind of accepting of their condition and docile and very rarely, ran away or something. There were all kinds of forms of resistance among the enslaved people. They poisoned their owners, they ran away, they would break their own leg to make sure they couldn't work. Not to mention outright rebellions that involved large numbers of people. Those are just individual acts that they did. They might even harm their own children. But that's not how we teach history. And we need to know about how much they fought back. And people on the outside who helped them through either, through the Underground Railroad or I was speaking the other day, and my book just came out 2 days ago. But I was at the New York Society Library the other night, and we talked a lot about John Brown, the abolitionist who tried to staged a raid against Harper's Ferry, which was then in Virginia. And how long he planned it, and he solicited people to help him, and there were black men who marched with him to on the raid. And black people loved him. So even after the raid failed, he was famous in black communities. And what I didn't know was how long he had planned this. He had been planning it, according to some of his associates, for 20 years. He didn't necessarily have Harper's Ferry in mind when he started out, but that was the idea. And I didn't know that his ambitions were so grand. He figured that if he could take Harper's Ferry and the federal arsenal there, that enslaved people all over the South would somehow rise up and free themselves. But given the time and his constraints, there was no way of getting word out to all of the enslaved people in the South. And his raid failed fairly quickly. But the fact that there were abolitionists who were that dedicated is also not taught, who went to such extremes to try to free the enslaved people. I think is not something we know.
That rebellion and resistance always part of our history. Yes, please.
I was just going to kind of follow up to Angela's point. I think one of the myths that we have in this country is that racism is kind of inherent to the fact that they're racist and that it was always here, as opposed to so the fact that we have different skin colors and come from different backgrounds, that automatically means that we will see each other as enemies. And that was how this country was founded. But the reality is, there were white indentured servants who came to this country who actually did see Black slaves as comrades, as folks in the fight. They actually were a part of some of these rebellions and really did work to try to free themselves. That they saw the fact that their economic oppression was similar. And so but the small kind of land owning population realized that if we allow them to see each other as allies, there's more of them than us, we will be destroyed. So we have to create a system to divide them. I think we have to appreciate that racism was designed to divide us. It was designed to do the very thing that it's still continuing to do. It's not inherent. It's not something that just happens because we have different colors. This was done by design. And I think if you can appreciate that, then you don't see somebody who doesn't look like you as a natural enemy. I think that's where we need to get to appreciate that this system was designed for us to fight over the small little crumbs of resources that are left. And so that's a big myth I think we have got to really address. That racism is real. It is a system in this country. We were structured based on that system, but it is not inherent. It is not, a natural order of things. I see Darren wanting to raise his hand.
Yeah. And if I may, I think it follows both the comments. The myth that I would like to see busted is the notion that being radically honest about America's failures from the start and continuing today, including the creation and use of racism, that is somehow anti-American and anti-patriotic. I would actually argue, as many have, that being radically honest about America's failures from the start and ongoing is the height of patriotism, right? Because those of us in our community and other communities that want to highlight America's failures from the start and ongoing failures, whether that relates to race, whether that relates to dishonesty around our history, that it actually is the height of patriotism. Because what we're seeking to do is we're seeking to transform America and push America to live up to the promise of its ideals, right? And so this notion that somehow calling out systemic racism or being truthful about our history, all the things that we've discussed today, is anti-American, right? As the gaslighters would argue. I want to bust that myth. No, actually, it's the height of patriotism.
It's what James Baldwin tells us, right? Which is, this is I love her. I love this country. I love this nation. And because of that, that's why I critique, right? That's why I fight. And so that's what you all are describing. Okay, I have one final question as I have to bring us to a close, which is, here we are on the eve of Juneteenth. We are also on the eve of our 250th celebration. What if there are people who care deeply about democracy and see these fissures and fractures and see these erasures and see this brokenness, but they care deeply? What is the one thing that you would tell them that they can do to hold on to the hope and to the promise of what America is for them?
I think we need to study some of the tactics that people who came before us used, and that's one of the purposes of my book. Is it going to require teach-ins like we had for the Vietnam War protests? Is it going to require picketing the White House every day for a year or two, as the women's suffrage leaders did? Is it going to require going to jail and perhaps going on hunger strikes? Is it just going to require a letter writing campaign? But each movement used different tactics to succeed or not succeed in the case of John Brown. But what did they do? What did they actually do? How did they actually communicate? Are we going to have to just start newspapers, as a lot of the abolitionists did, that speak to a particular issue? There are all kinds of things that people who came before us attempted and used to good effect in many cases, like the sit-ins, the marches. We need to study these people and decide which tactics speak to the moment we're in.
I'm sorry, Darren. I know I'm going out of order, but I just wanted to kind of follow up on Angela, because honestly, I feel like our book has the exact same message. It's just told from a different vantage point. I think the message of my book is also that there are strategies in our past. And the main strategy that I highlight, which I think Angela is doing as well, is the power of collective action. It's so important. And I think for me, I started the book because honestly, my hope in the beginning lived in a person, right? I had this radical hope at when President Obama was elected. I mean, it touched me in a way. I was at the inauguration. I felt like, oh my gosh, this is possible. I mean, it was amazing and powerful for me. And then, fast forward, and we're seeing all of this, and I started to get disillusioned. And in the research for my book, and with every chapter, looking at every strategy that was used to counter social justice in the past, as well as those strategies that were successful in championing social justice, I realized that the hope is not in those powerful, charismatic individuals. Those folks absolutely are great to help us to have that feeling and to expand our power, to spread it, but they're not the impact. The impact is the people. It's us coming together. So when we see each other standing up saying, no, no, injustice to one is injustice to us all, that is what we should be seeing as hope, right? Not who can we get to lead us and be our leader. No, no, those folks are great. They're hopeful. But the power is in our ability to come together and say, we will stand up for this. We will not be moved, and we will affect change. And so for me, that's the biggest piece. I think that's the message in Angela's book, which I thought was very similar to my message. And so I just wanted to kind of make sure that I jumped in here, because I feel like she goes in depth with the movements, right? And my focus is more on what are the strategies that are being used, and how have those been countered. In all of my research, it's collective action. That's the antidote.
Darren?
And I would just follow that by agreeing absolutely with the collective action sentiment. And what I would add to it is, based on my book and what I've researched, I've discussed just a whole new angle at which democracy is being undermined. But really, this new technology is simply seeking to do what has been done before, which is to suppress votes, which is to prevent people from gaining access, which is to negatively impact information that people are receiving. So it's some of the same tactics just being used through a new form of technology. And so what I might add to the conversation is that just the idea that we the people need to be ever vigilant about the new form of attacks that will occur to democracy, right? And realizing that, we've had our successes, and in many ways, some of us, myself included, maybe assumed that the gains that had been accomplished would always be there. And I think what the present moment has shown us is that no, we need to be ever vigilant. And in fact, our vigilance also needs to take account of the new ways and new tactics to undermine democracy that evolve over time with new technologies, and to collectively act to respond to those as well.
I love that. I love that. Thank you all so much. Thank you for being a part of this conversation. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and your expertise. And also thank you for still the sense of hope that there is work to be done, but we can do it because we have so many examples in our history of those who have, in ways big and small, kept our democracy alive. And so I want to thank you for sharing your wisdom, for sharing your expertise. And I hope that we all leave today with the clearer understanding of, yes, the challenges before us, but also with renewed courage and hope. And I just want to let the audience know that if you registered for today's webinar, you'll receive links to each of our panelists' books to help you in your journey. Thank you so much for joining us, and we wish you a happy Juneteenth and also a very cautious celebration of America at 250. Thank you.